Hi guys, and welcome back to another fun-filled video. This is going to be on homework 11-11, which, I'm sorry, 11-1, which is on irrational numbers, including graphing square roots, graphing inequalities, absolute values, as well as um, solving for irrational roots. Um, First thing, before we start, I want to show you guys a cool little program I found. It's called WebEmu. Um, with WebEmu, sorry. Just pull it up on the Play Store for the Android, and I'm sure you can download it on the iTunes Store. Um, so, what you can do is take a look here. WebEmu. Okay. And then you can install it. It's going to ask you to do something weird, but all you have to do is basically say open source or something like that, and go to the TI-84 Plus calculator, and you'll basically have like a real calculator in front of you, and you'll need it for the graphing functions. Okay, so I have a graphing calculator with me, so we'll just do it there, just in case you stole one. Anyway, so the graphing of the function f of x is square root of x, and g of x is square root of x plus 4 minus 2 on the graph below. Find the domain, so let's graph those first. And go to y equals the square root of x, like so. And then go to the table. And notice, remember, you cannot have a negative square root. So having like the square root of -1, it gives you an error. That's okay. But we're going to start at 0, 0. So 0, 0. Keep looking at the chart. You'll notice the square root of 1 is 1. Makes sense. 2 and 3 do not have rational roots. So therefore the square root of 4 is 2. Oops. Okay. And then square root of 5, 6, 7, and 8 do not have rational. And 9 is 3. Okay. And you're going to draw sort of curve-like fashion like that. I totally just missed that. And we're going to put a little arrow at the end because it's going to keep going in that direction. And this is f of x. Okay. Now, g of x is the square root of 4. Square root of 4. X plus 4. Okay. We go out of the square root and we put minus 2. Okay. Now, when we get your table of values, notice some of the x values can be negative. Okay? But once you get to -5, it doesn't. The reason is because we have this x minus 4, plus 4 in here. Therefore, if you put -4 in, -4 plus 4 is 0. The square root of 0 is 0. Okay? So, starting at -4, we can start graphing. Okay? We get -2, okay? -3, -1 works. Okay? Then we get to the next one, 0, 0 can be plotted. Okay? And when we keep going, 5, 1. Okay? That one works. And then if we keep going, remember the biggest x value on our graph is 10. Once I get to 10, it's still under 2. Okay? The next one would be 12, 2, but we can't graph that. So we're going to, this is our start point. Okay? We're going to graph it, keep going, and then we're just going to draw a line that doesn't go over the 2. And this is g of x. Okay? Now, notice the graphs look very similar. Okay? So there's sort of like a shift going on. So find the domain and range for f of x. Okay? To find the domain and range of f of x, what we're going to do is just look at the graph. Domain, remember, is all the x values. Now, x could not be smaller than 0. Okay? So therefore, x has to be greater than or equal to 0. Okay? And the range, okay, take a look at the y values. The smallest y value is 0. Okay? And it's just going to keep getting bigger and bigger. So the range is y is greater than or equal to 0. Okay? Now, let's take a look at g of x. G of x is a little different. Okay? G of x, the smallest x value I could get was -4. So x is greater than or equal to -4. Okay? And the range, the smallest y value here is -2. So the range is going to be y is greater than or equal to negative 2. Okay. Now, determine the shift from f of x to g of x. This is very similar to the vertex shift when we have the parabolas before. Take a look at the endpoint. Okay? That will tell you where the shift is. So if I go 1, 2, 3, 4 to the left and down 2, we can get our new graph. So 4 to the left and down 2. Okay? Once again, we go 1, 2, 3, 4 to the left, down 2. Okay? Okay, let's take a look at the next problem. Next one has to do with these two lines called the absolute value. Okay? If you go into your graphing calculator, which you should have on your phone by now, you're going to go to Math, Num, and the first one is ABS, that stands for the absolute value. Okay? So the absolute value of x is going to be our first function. Now notice, all the x values match the y values, but when we get to negatives, they become positive. So this should be an easy function to graph. Okay? We'll start with negative 10. We know it's going to be 10. We keep going down until we get to 0. Now once we get to 0, okay, it's 0, but then 1 becomes 1. Because remember, the absolute value basically gets rid of the sign. So if it's negative, it becomes positive, and as positive, it becomes stays positive. Okay, now, remember, these are going to be two straight lines connected at 0. Okay, and this is going to be our, like, sort of vertex. Now the other graph, and by the way, this is h of x. Now we're going to graph the other function. So we go to num, absolute value again. Now this time we're going to put x minus 3 into your calculator. Go out of the absolute value and put plus 1 to get k of x. And we're going to go to the table. And if you look at the table of values, notice negative 10 now is 14, negative 9, 13, and then the first one we can really plot is negative 6, 10. So negative 6, 10, okay? And then we're going to keep going down. If you look at your table of values, you can plot these points pretty easily. Until we get to 3, 1. Okay? And I just know this because I know the problem. But if you just look at your calculator, you can plot all the points. Then you notice that it turns around and starts going back up again. And we'll talk about y in a second. Okay. This is going to be our k of x value. Okay. Now, with this, you need to remember, with this function, we have x minus 3 inside the absolute value plus 1. Okay. Remember with the parabolas, we always switch the sign. So this means we're going to move to the right 3 and up 1. So if you take every point, 1, 2, 3, move it up 1, it does that. Okay. And if you check, let's say, this point, 1, 2, 3, up 1. 1, 2, 3, up 1. Okay. And we'll get the other value. So let's start with the domain and range of h of x. Okay. So the domain, remember, is the x values. The x value can be all real numbers. Okay? There's no restriction on what goes inside the square root. Only what comes out. All real numbers, not all real x's. Now the range is going to be when y is greater than or equal to 0. Okay? Because remember, this cannot go below the x-axis. Okay? So the smallest number is 0, and it's going to go up. Now, what about for k of x? The domain is going to be the same, all real numbers. Okay. Now for the range, what's going to happen is, we're going to go, the lowest value can be is 1. Okay? So y is going to be greater than or equal to 1. Okay? Now, determine the shift from h of x to k of x. Okay? Now, h of x to k of x, we already mentioned, we go to the right 3 and up 1. Okay? And that has to do with the formula. You can just sort of figure that out from there. x minus 3 plus 1. Okay? Alright, let's take a look at number 3. Okay, so for number 3, we're going to be solving for x. Now, first step is to add 4 to both sides. Okay? So that becomes x minus 3 squared equals 25. Okay? Now, this is the key step. You need to take the square root of both sides. Okay? So the square root and the square will cancel out. We'll be left with x minus 3. However, when we are taking the square root, you need to take into account that the square root can be positive and negative. Okay, so we put plus or minus in front of the radical. Now, remember your square roots. Square root of 25 is 5. Okay? So now we can add 3 to both sides. Okay? And x is equal to 3 plus or minus 5. Okay? Remember, this is two separate answers. This is 3 plus 5, okay? And this is also 3 minus 5. What's 3 plus 5 is 8. 3 minus 5 is negative 2. Okay? So therefore, x can be equal to 8 or negative 2. Okay? Alright. Now, do the same thing here. First step, we're going to add 4 to both sides. Okay? So we get x squared over 3 equals 14. Okay? Now you can multiply both sides by 3, or if you want, you can cross multiply. So we get x squared, okay, equals 14 times 3, which is 42. Then we take the square root. And remember, what happens when we take the square root? Okay? It's going to be plus or minus the square root of 42. You should double check to make sure you cannot make this into simplest radical form, which we cannot, so therefore we'll call it a day. Okay? Now, let's take a look at the next problem, number 5. Okay? Now this is where we get into the completing the square. Okay? Now you need to be really good at completing the square in order to do this type of problem. Okay? So, the first step is find the zeros of the function by completing the square. Okay? Now, first step here, we can set this equation equal to 0 because they're looking for the zeros of the function. Basically, when f of x equals 0, what is x? So, to get to the completing the square part, we take the number in front of the x, which is negative 6. Notice, there's no number in front of the a, so we have to divide by that number. Okay? Then we're going to divide it by 2. We get negative 3. Put that in parentheses and square it, and we get 9. This will tell us the number that we're going to add and subtract. So we get x squared minus 6x, and then remember we're going to add 9 and subtract 9. Okay? This should be equal to 0. Okay? Remember, we're not changing the value of the function, so plus 9 minus 9 is important. Okay? Now, this box here is going to be a perfect square trinomial. Okay, you can double check. Two numbers that multiply by 9 that add to 6 is 3 and 3. They're both going to be negative. Also, remember the little trick. Look inside the parentheses over here. That's the number that's going to be inside the parentheses here. So x minus 3 squared, okay, minus 6 equals 0. Okay. Now we're going to add 6 to both sides. So I got x minus 3 squared equals 6. We're going to take the square root. Remember, when we take the square root, it is going to be plus or minus radical 6. Okay. Finally, we're going to add 3 to both sides. So x is equal to 3 plus or minus radical 6. Remember, this is two separate answers. This is x equals 3 plus radical 6, and x equals 3 minus radical 6. Okay? Make sure you realize there are two answers that we have. Now, we're going to do this again, but now it's a little bit trickier because I have this 3 in front. Okay? If I have this 3, we're going to have to do an extra step. We can't just jump into the dividing by 2. Okay? Remember, you're going to divide by a, and then at the end you're going to multiply by a. So, first things first, we're looking for the 0, so I'm going to set that equal to 0. The b value in this case is 12. So we're going to first divide that by 3, the a value. I get 4. Now we're going to take that 4, divide it by 2. 4 divided by 2 is 2. Put that in parentheses and square it. And we get 4. Now, we're going to multiply this again by the a. So we're going to get 12. Now remember, split up the last two terms. So we each are going to split up the 12x and the negative 10 by putting plus 12, minus 12, and then minus 10. Remember, this should be equal to 0. Just our little scrap work over there. Now remember, the first three are going to make a perfect square trinomial. Okay? First things first, you got to get rid of that a. The a value in front of the x squared is 3. Okay? We're going to do x squared plus 4x plus 4 minus 22 equals 0. Okay? Now we're going to really make this a perfect square trinomial. This is x. Do you remember the multiply before that adds to 4? Or positive 2 and 2. Okay? And also remember, that's the number inside the parentheses. So we put minus 22 equals 0. We're going to add 22 to both sides. Okay. So we get 3 times x plus 2 squared. Okay. That goes away, and I'm left with 22. Divide this by 3. Okay. Then we get x plus 2 squared equals 22 over 3. We're going to take the square root. I'm realizing now I probably should give you a little bit more room. X plus 2 equals plus or minus square root of 22 over 3. Okay. Now we first have to subtract the 2 to both sides. Okay. I'll put the final answer up here because I'm out of room. So x is equal to negative 2 plus or minus the square root of 22 over 3. Okay. Remember, this is two separate answers. Okay. Now, depending on what's going on, we may have to rationalize the denominator. We'll talk about that later on. Okay, let's take a look at this next one. Find the zeroth of the function by completing the square. So, we have negative 2x plus 18 plus 29. We have an a value, so we're going to have to first do 18 divided by negative 2. Give me negative 9. Negative 9 divided by 2 gives me negative 4.5. Okay. I purposely made this one a little bit more difficult. You have to square it, so we get negative 4.5 squared. We get 20.25. Okay. Now remember, we always have to multiply by the negative 2 again. Multiply by the a value. So, we multiply that by negative 2, and we get negative 40.5. Okay? This one's not going to be very pretty. Okay? So, we're going to put the negative 2x plus 18. Remember, splitting these two guys up. Here comes a little issue. I got negative 40.5 as the value I'm going to be adding. So, we're going to need to put that negative 40.5 first, and then figure out what we have to add to it. We do we're going to add 40.5. Remember, this should be equal to 0. Okay. Then I put back this plus 29. Now, what am I going to be left with? Okay. I'm going to put a box around the first 3. I'm going to pull out the negative 2. Okay. Whoops, there should be a square there, guys. Now, this will be x squared minus 9x plus 20.25 after we factor out the negative 2. Okay. And this one, we add these two together, we get 69.5. Remember, this whole thing is going to be equal to 0. Now, what we have to do, I'm going to first subtract 69.5 to both sides. Okay. So we get negative 2. Oh, sorry guys, I forgot to make this a perfect square trinomial. This is really x minus 4.5 squared, and that comes from here. Yeah, so let's go back to that. Subtract 69.5. X minus 4.5 squared equals negative 69.5. Divide everything by negative 2. Get x minus 4.5 squared equals, that becomes actually a pretty nice number. Well, not super nice, but looks like positive 34.75. Then we're going to take the square root of both sides. And remember, key stuff, square roots cancels out with the square, and we get plus or minus the square root of 34.75. Now x equals, I'm going to add 4.5 to both sides. We have 4.5 plus or minus the square root of 34.75. Okay? Now once again, this is not a very nice number. Sorry. Sometimes it will work out to be nice. And I apologize, I was reading it and did not notice I was off the camera. Okay. Alright, now let's take a look at number 8. Find the zeros of the function. Hint, use the quadratic formula. Now, you could always find the zeros by using the quadratic, completing the square method. But if you memorize the quadratic formula, remember the quadratic formula is x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. I know it seems impossible to memorize, but I'm not looking at anything. I've been dealing with it for years. It's something that you need to remember. Okay? Now, this will tell you what the roots are. This actually works in any factoring case when they ask you to find the zeros. Okay? So first things first, we need to make sure it's in standard form, so x squared minus 6x plus 3, standard form. So a is equal to the number in front of the x squared term, so that's going to be 1. B is the number in front of the x term, so that's negative 6. And c is is a constant term, and that'll be positive 3. All you have to do is plug it in. And please make sure you're careful. So negative 6, okay, plus or minus the square root of negative 6 squared, okay, minus 4 times 1 times 3, okay, all over 2 times 1. So basically plug in the a, b, and c values into the equation. Okay? Now, to simplify this a little more, first take a look here. I got negative, negative, it becomes positive. Okay? Now the inside, you can put that whole thing right into your calculator if you need to, but this is also 36 minus 12, which is 36 minus 12 is 24. Okay? And this is all over 2. Now, one thing that's important, to make a little side note, square root of 24 can break down into a perfect square and not a perfect square. Square root of 24 is the square root of 4 times the square root of 6. And we know the square root of 4 is 2, and the radical 6 is done. So, we have 6 plus or minus. We're going to change the square root of 24 into 2 radical 6. All over 2. Now, because I have 6 divided by 2 and 2 divided by 2, we can simplify that. Okay, so 6 divided by 2 is 3. Radical 2 divided by 2 is 1. And we get plus or minus 6. Now, this breaks down into 2 answers. 3 plus radical 6 and 3 minus radical 6. Now notice, we did the same method twice. We did it with completing the square, and we did it with the quadratic formula. Okay? They both look about the same amount of work, and we got the same exact answers. So please pick whichever one you feel most comfortable with. unless I specifically say, or the region specifically says, to do it a certain way. Okay? Now let's take a look at this next one. Okay? Now, 3x squared plus 12x plus 10 equals 14. In order to use the quadratic formula, you need to set the equation equal to 0. Okay? So we're going to get 3x squared plus 12x minus 4 equals 0. Okay? Find your a, b, and c values. A is 3, okay? B is 12, and c is negative 4. Okay? So now just go into the quadratic formula, okay, which is up above. You can copy it down. Here it is again. Pause it and copy it down. Okay? So x is equal to negative 12 plus or minus the square root of 12 squared minus 4 times 3 times negative 4. Okay? All over 2 times a, which is, in this case, 3. Okay? Now simplify each part separately. Negative 12 will be the first part. Okay? Inside the square root, if you put that into your calculator, okay, we get 144. We get square root of 192, okay, all over 6. Okay. Now 192 is actually divisible by a perfect square. Okay. Figure it out, go through them all, but it's actually going to be 64 and 3. Okay. Now the square root of 64 is 8, radical 3. Okay. So we can replace this with 8 radical 3, so negative 12 plus or minus 8 radical 3 all over 6. Now notice, nothing seems to simplify. Okay? You can make this a little simpler if you'd like, okay, by just splitting it up. So negative 12 divided by 6 plus or minus 8 radical 3 divided by 6. Negative 12 divided by 6 is going to be negative 2. Okay. 8 divided by 6 is not going evenly, but it is 4 over 3. So 4 radical 3 over 3. Okay. So this will be your final answer for x. Remember, there are 2 answers here. I think that's the last problem, and then we are finished. So I got negative 2x squared minus 5x plus 10 equals 14. First step, add 14 to both sides. We got to set it equal to 0. Negative 2x squared minus 5x plus 28 equals 0. Okay. Now find your a, b, and c values. A is negative 2, b is negative 5, and c is 28. Okay. Now, you're just going to plug it into the quadratic formula. And I'm just going to start up here because I feel like this is going to be a really long problem. So, what we're going to do, put negative 5 plus or minus the square root of b squared, so negative 5 squared minus 4 times a, which is negative 2, times c, which is 28. Okay. All over 2 times negative 2. Okay. Now, putting it down here, we're going to end up with 5 plus or minus the square root, and inside the square root, you put that right into your calculator. Make sure you put your parentheses because you will get it wrong if you don't. Okay. And we get 249. Okay. And this goes all over negative 4. Now, square root of 249 is not a nice number at all. Okay? So, what that means is that your final answer is going to be this. However, we don't like to have the negatives on the bottom. Okay? So, here it comes. We're going to do 5 over negative 4 plus or minus square root of 249 divided by negative 4. Now remember, we have the plus or minus here. Okay? What's going to happen when you have the plus or minus? and then you're dividing by negative, it just can become the other sign. So that doesn't really do anything to this. Now, however, 5 divided by negative 4, that does change things. You can put this negative right on top. So, putting the answers back together, negative 5 over 4 plus or minus the square root of 249 over 4. Okay? Remember, we didn't have to do anything to the plus or minus because the positive becomes negative, the negative becomes positive, and we just switch spots. Okay? So you can leave your answer like this, or if you really feel so inclined, you can put them back together. Okay? And put the whole thing over 4 because we do have a common denominator. Okay, that's all for me. Have fun.